Confinement in Caesarea. We're continuing the study of the book of Acts, looking at chapter 24 through 26, and it's about politics, law, and gospel.
Paul arrived in Caesarea as an arrested Roman citizen who was to be tried by the governor of Judea, Felix. What happened there? Who also met with Paul there? These are all questions we want to answer in this week's lesson.
To protect the Roman citizen Paul from being killed by the Jewish leaders, and to provide him his day in court, a privilege owed to Roman citizens, the Roman commander sends Paul to the governor.
Yes, first in Caesarea, Paul meets with the governor Felix. Not by chance he was escorted there by the Roman commander. The governor in the province was responsible for the whole province, the accounting of the taxes, the leading of the province's army, and also he was the supreme judge of the province. So next level was just an appeal to Rome, to the Caesar. Possible but expensive trip. Paul stood before him and a delegation from Jerusalem, which was consisted by the high priest himself, some members from the Sanhedrin, and a lawyer who spoke on their behalf. First, the judge listened to the charges from the lawyer Tertullus from Jerusalem. Then the apostle spoke in his defense. Simply, the first side had no evidence whatsoever that could have alleged the apostle in breaking the Roman law. The judge closed the case by saying, "When Lysias, the Roman commander, comes, I will decide your case." What stands out for me in this whole scenario is the determination from the high priest and his company to travel this distance from Jerusalem to Caesarea and spare no effort and money on their purpose, to have Paul killed. On the other side, Paul appeared to be very educated in the laws and practices of the Romans and confidently repelled any accusation against him. Not much was talked about God in this meeting, or in Paul's message for that matter. This was not a spiritual but a judicial and a procedural meeting between Paul and the governor Felix.
Actually, they had other similar meetings, and according to verses 24 and 25 in chapter 24, Felix sent for Paul and listened to him as he spoke about faith in Christ Jesus. As Paul talked about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix was afraid and said, "That's enough for now. You may leave. When I find it convenient, I'll send for you." Don't you find it ironic that often we have to rely on Roman law to protect us from religious justice? It was obvious that Paul didn't commit anything criminal, but it was a political gain and a burden that no one was pleased to take. The Jews wanted him dead more than anything, and they were ready to anything for that. Even to praise the Roman who was so violent and repressive to their people for his great foresight to provide reform and peace, for which, by the way, they were very grateful. Low flattery strategy. And then a simple appeal. Let's get rid of this troublemaker. He is not good for business. And if Paul wasn't a Roman citizen, it would have ended by now.
2 years have passed since Paul arrived in Caesarea and a new governor was appointed, Porcius Festus. He simply inherited the same issue with Paul from the previous governor. Now, as a new governor, he wanted to please the Jewish leaders. And after being asked for a favor by them, as we read in Acts 25:3, to have Paul transferred back to Jerusalem to appear before their courts, he decided in response to invite them back and present their accusation in Caesarea. Again, all accusations were repelled by the apostle successfully. However, even though Festus had no grounds to do so, he made an attempt to transfer Paul back to Jerusalem to stand a trial there, if he agrees on that terms, which meant for the apostle a certain death. Paul clearly denied that and claimed his right to appeal before the Caesar. The governor granted him his wish. The outcome was Paul and Festus met, and their encounter was formal, procedural, and by the code.
Festus doesn't like the responsibility of this case. He wants to keep the Jews happy, but he can't just hand them a man with no crime for execution. He just wants the problem gone. He wanted them to resolve their religious issue in Jerusalem. But Paul preferred Caesar. When Caesar is more desirable than the priest, it does say something.
Next, Paul gets to meet King Agrippa. King Agrippa was a Jew. He was very much familiar with the Torah, and he was educated in the practices of the temple and the Jewish law. Why did they meet? How did this happen? Festus, the governor, gets a visit from King Agrippa and his sister Bernice. Festus is not sure what to write down as an accusation against Paul in his letter to the Caesar. He asks Agrippa for help, and Agrippa agrees, and they set up a meeting together with Paul. Paul speaks to the king of the Jews differently in comparison to his meetings with the governors. Stories, words, and meanings that Agrippa could have understood and could have related to because of his origin. He tells his own story, personal story. First, he is a Pharisee, then he meets Jesus, then he is the apostle of the Gentiles, then the Messiah had to suffer and he had to be resurrected. And this is where the governor himself is the one who interrupts his speech. For him, this is foolish, where Agrippa is distant and reserved in creating any relationship with the apostle. However, in his own words, in Acts 26:31, he says, "This man is not doing anything that deserves death or imprisonment."
Paul was testifying about an impostor that the Jewish leadership forced the Romans to execute. And Paul was now saying that this same Jesus was now alive and resurrected, that they met and even talked. Paul was sharing how his eyes opened, and even though opposing it strongly at first, he now sees how Jesus accomplished what the prophets were talking about. Legally, there was no issue. In essence, he was accused of preaching about resurrection. But spiritually, the issue was much bigger, and Paul hoped that Agrippa would see it. For the Romans, this was foolishness. But for the Jew who grew up expecting the Messiah and studying the scriptures, this should make sense. For Agrippa, though, it was too big of a change to happen so quickly.
Following Paul in his previous mission journeys and now standing before governors and kings reveals how great of a person he is, but not only, how great and faithful as a Christian he was. The truth is that his ministry slowed down in numbers when he was arrested. However, it reached the highest levels of the society. And not only that, but the book of Acts also discloses that certain familiarity there was on behalf of the governor and the King Agrippa to the Way movement. Apostle Paul is the real representation of Jew for the Jews and Gentile for the Gentiles, Roman for the Romans, educated for the educated, professional for the professionals, and etc. He made every effort possible only to have more people choosing to follow Christ. He also demonstrated that the walls and the limitations in the confinement are not a barrier for spreading the gospel.
What were the Romans learning about the God of Israel from his representatives, from the national spiritual leadership, and from Paul? Join us next week when Paul is getting his promised journey to Rome.